Dominic Ashford stood in the private viewing suite overlooking the grand ballroom, fingers resting against the tinted glass that separated him from the scene below. 2 floors down, Victoria Laurent moved through her final dress fitting, the ivory silk catching afternoon light as 3 assistants adjusted the train. She laughed at something the seamstress said, that practiced laugh he'd heard 1,000 times in boardrooms and negotiations, the one that signaled she'd already won whatever game was being played. She had no idea he was watching, no idea he'd signed the partnership agreement with Sterling Whitmore 90 minutes ago, the ink still drying on documents that included a very specific clause about intellectual property attribution. No idea that in 72 hours everything she thought she'd left behind would return to define her forever. The suite door opened behind him. Elise Carrington entered carrying 2 cups of coffee, her expression the same focused calm she'd maintained through 37 days of preparation. "They're setting up the signing table for Saturday. Conference suite 2 floors below the ceremony." Dominic accepted the coffee without turning from the window. Victoria was examining her reflection now, tilting her head the way she always did when calculating angles and outcomes. "She thinks I signed away my leverage. Sterling certainly does." Below, Victoria's phone buzzed. She checked it, smiled, typed a response. Probably Sterling confirming that the difficult ex-fiancé had finally seen reason, had finally understood that fighting was futile. "In 3 days," Dominic said quietly, "she'll understand what it means to underestimate someone." Elise moved beside him, her own gaze steady on the scene below. "In 3 days, the record gets corrected." 8 years earlier, Dominic had been 34 and convinced he'd found the one element missing from his career trajectory. Not romance, though that came too. What he'd found in Victoria Laurent was someone who understood that contracts were battlefields and every clause was territory worth defending. They'd met at the Northern California Legal Innovation Conference, one of those gatherings where ambitious attorneys networked and pretended the free wine wasn't the main attraction. Dominic had just made junior partner at Hartwell and Associates, a boutique firm specializing in tech startup contract architecture. His presentation on embedded poison pills in operating agreements had drawn maybe 40 people to a side ballroom. Victoria had been sitting in the 3rd row, taking notes with the kind of intensity that suggested she wasn't there for CLE credits. Afterward, she'd approached with questions that proved she'd actually understood the material. "The trap you identified in slide 17, the one disguised as a protective drag-along clause. How often do you see that deployed intentionally versus accidentally?" Most attorneys asked about his success rate or his client list. Victoria wanted to know about methodology. Intentionally? Maybe 30% of the time. The rest is lazy lawyers copying templates without understanding the mechanics. She'd smiled at that, sharp and genuine. "That's what I thought. I'm Victoria Laurent, M&A at Berkshire Stone. We spend half our time untangling messes created by people who don't read their own contracts." They'd talked for 2 hours, well past the conference closing remarks, dissecting the psychology of contract negotiation. Victoria approached legal strategy like chess, always thinking 5 moves ahead, always aware of what the other side thought they wanted versus what they actually needed. 3 weeks later, she'd called with a proposal. One of her M&A clients needed a complete IP protection framework for a pending acquisition. The kind of work that required someone who could see traps before they were set. "I can negotiate the deal structure, but the underlying contract architecture needs someone who thinks like you do. Interested in collaborating?" The client was a mid-stage biotech company, the kind of engagement that could establish a reputation. Dominic had said yes, the collaboration had been seamless. Victoria handled the high-level negotiations while Dominic built the protective frameworks underneath, eliminating vulnerabilities and ensuring the client couldn't be outmaneuvered post-acquisition. The deal closed in 43 days, and the client's CEO sent a case of wine with a note suggesting they work together permanently. By the end of that first year, they'd structured 12 major transactions. Victoria brought the clients and the deal flow. Dominic designed the protections that kept those clients from being destroyed by their own agreements. Revenue hit $3 million, split evenly after expenses. By year 2, they weren't just professional partners. Dominic remembered the night it shifted. Late February past midnight, both of them still at his office reviewing a particularly complex stock option framework. Victoria had been working at Berkshire Stone for 6 years, hungry for partnership, but increasingly frustrated by the firm's politics and billable hour quotas. "I could do this on my own," she'd said, not looking up from the document. "Leave Berkshire, take my client relationships, build something independent." "You could. But I'm better at closing deals than building frameworks, and you're better at architecture than client development." She'd finally looked at him then, something shifting in her expression. "We're good together, Dominic. Professionally, I mean. We fill each other's gaps." He'd leaned back, studying her. Victoria at 31 was all sharp edges and controlled ambition, the kind of person who measured every interaction for strategic value, but there was something underneath that calculation, something he'd glimpsed in moments when she forgot to perform. What if we made it official? A real partnership, not just project-by-project collaboration. The pause had stretched long enough to make him wonder if he'd miscalculated. Then Victoria had smiled, the genuine version, not the boardroom performance. "I was hoping you'd suggest that." They'd filed the partnership papers within a month. Victoria left Berkshire Stone, taking 3 major clients with her and weathering the inevitable threats of litigation that came with high-profile departures. Dominic brought his contract expertise and his growing reputation as someone who could untangle impossible structural problems. The first year as official partners, they'd generated $8 million in revenue. The second year, $15 million. By year 3, they had a staff of 4 associates and a client roster that included some of the fastest-growing tech companies in the Bay Area. Somewhere in the middle of building that success, the professional partnership had evolved into something else. Dominic couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. Maybe it was the night they'd celebrated their first 8-figure year with takeout Chinese in the office, both too exhausted to go anywhere fancy. Maybe it was the morning Victoria had shown up with coffee and bagels after he'd pulled an all-nighter debugging a catastrophic contract error for a panicked client. What he remembered clearly was the certainty, the feeling that he'd found someone who understood not just his work but the way he thought, the patterns he saw, the traps he anticipated. He'd proposed on the rooftop of their first major client's IPO celebration. Nothing elaborate, just the 2 of them away from the party noise, overlooking the city lights. "We're good at building things together. Companies, protections, solutions." He'd pulled out the ring, simple and elegant, nothing ostentatious. "I want to build a life together, too." Victoria's eyes had gone bright, and for once she hadn't calculated angles or measured outcomes. She'd just said yes. "Always together," she'd whispered against his shoulder when he'd pulled her close. "That's the only way this works. Both of us. All in. No hedging." For 3 years, that's exactly what it had been. The shift started so gradually that Dominic almost missed it. Looking back later, he'd be able to trace the exact timeline, the precise moments when Victoria's attention began redirecting. But in real time, it felt like nothing more than the natural evolution of a growing business. Sterling Whitmore's fund had first approached them in January of the 4th year. Whitmore Capital was one of those venture firms with a Midas reputation. $2 billion fund, portfolio companies worth a combined $20 billion. Sterling himself profiled in Forbes as the man who could spot the next unicorn before anyone else saw potential. The approach had come through a mutual connection. Sterling's team was restructuring their portfolio companies' governance frameworks, and needed specialists who understood both the technical architecture and the deal dynamics. Exactly the kind of high-profile engagement that could elevate their firm's reputation another level. The first meeting had been at Sterling's Sand Hill Road offices, all glass and steel and carefully curated modern art. Sterling himself was 45, Yale MBA, third-generation money that he'd multiplied into genuine empire. Handsome in that way wealthy men often were. Expensive haircuts, tailored suits, the confidence that came from never having to worry about baseline survival. Victoria had been impressive in that meeting. She always was. Dominic watched her navigate Sterling's questions with the perfect blend of expertise and deference, demonstrating knowledge while making the client feel brilliant for recognizing it. Sterling had hired them on the spot. 6-month engagement, generous retainer, potential for expansion if the work met expectations. The work had been complex and consuming. Sterling's portfolio included 17 companies, each with tangled cap tables and governance structures that needed forensic analysis and surgical correction. Dominic spent months buried in documents, identifying the poison pills and structural traps that previous lawyers had either missed or deliberately embedded. Victoria handled the client relationship, which meant regular meetings with Sterling and his team, dinners to discuss strategy, weekend sessions when deals needed urgent attention. Dominic hadn't thought much of it initially. This was how high-stakes client work functioned. You made yourself available, you demonstrated commitment, you built trust. But somewhere around month 3, something shifted in the way Victoria talked about Sterling. The admiration became more personal, less professional. She started referencing his opinions on matters outside the immediate work, his thoughts on firm growth strategy, his perspective on scaling partnerships. Sterling thinks we're limiting ourselves by staying boutique. He says firms like ours should be building toward acquisition or serious expansion, not just maintaining steady-state revenue. They'd been reviewing financials when she'd said it, late April evening in their office. Dominic had looked up from the spreadsheet. We've grown 40% year over year for 4 straight years. That's not steady state. I know. I'm just saying there's a bigger vision possible. Sterling sees paths we haven't considered. The comment had landed wrong, carried an implication that their current trajectory was somehow insufficient. But Dominic had let it pass, told himself Victoria was just processing new perspectives. The public comments started in May. The first one came at an investor dinner, one of those semi-social events where founders and funders mixed over expensive wine and positioned for advantage. Victoria had been describing their firm's approach when someone asked about division of labor. Dominic's brilliant at the technical details, the contract architecture and structural analysis. But he doesn't always see the bigger strategic picture. That's where I come in. The table had laughed politely. Dominic had felt something tighten in his chest but kept his expression neutral. Later in the car, he'd mentioned it. That comment about me not seeing the bigger picture, that's not really accurate. Victoria had waved it off. I was just differentiating our skill sets for the audience. You know how these things work. Everyone wants clear roles. Clear roles is fine. Making me sound myopic isn't. She'd been quiet for a moment, then reached over to squeeze his hand. You're right. I'll be more careful with the framing. But the framing kept happening. Small comments in meetings, subtle repositioning that made Victoria the strategic visionary and Dominic the technical executor. Individually, each instance was minor enough to ignore. Collectively, they created a narrative. By July, Victoria was spending 3 evenings a week at dinners or events with Sterling's circle. Networking, she called it, building relationships that would generate future business. Dominic couldn't argue with the logic. Their biggest clients came through referrals and reputation. What he could argue with was the money. The first request came in September. Victoria needed $18,000 for an executive presence coaching program that Sterling had recommended. Something about preparing for the next level of client engagement. learning to command rooms the way top-tier advisors did. Dominic had hesitated. 18,000 was real money even with their revenue. But Victoria had framed it as an investment in their shared future, in the firm's growth trajectory. Sterling says the difference between firms that plateau at 20 million and firms that scale to 100 million is often just executive presence. The ability to walk into any room and be taken seriously as a peer, not just a service provider. He'd authorized the draw from their business account. In November, she'd needed 32,000 for wardrobe. Not just suits, but the kind of high-end clothing that signaled you belonged in Sterling's world. Brunello Cucinelli, Tom Ford, pieces that cost more than some people's monthly rent. I know it seems excessive, but appearance matters at this level. When I'm sitting across from Sterling in a meeting with a portfolio CEO, I can't look like the junior associate. I need to look like a peer. Dominic had pushed back this time. 32,000 for clothes felt less like business investment and more like personal spending. We're doing well, but we're not Sterling Whitmore wealthy. There's a difference between professional and pretending to be something we're not. Victoria's expression had cooled. I'm not pretending. I'm positioning. And if you can't see the difference, maybe that's the problem. The argument had ended with Dominic approving the expense, but the air between them staying tense for days afterward. The third request came in January, 41,000 for what Victoria called strategic advisory services. Sterling had connected her with a consultant who specialized in helping professional services firms scale. 3 months of intensive coaching on client development, pricing strategy, and market positioning. By this point, Dominic had started tracking the spending. 91,000 in 5 months, all justified as business development, but all connected to Sterling's world and Sterling's recommendations. This is a lot of money going out the door without clear ROI, he'd said when she'd presented the proposal. The ROI is the relationships I'm building, the clients I'm positioning us to land. Sterling's already talking about introducing us to 2 of his LPs who are looking to restructure their direct investments. And we're supposed to spend nearly 100,000 to maybe get introduced to potential clients? Victoria had stood up from the table, her voice going quiet in that way that meant genuine anger rather than tactical frustration. I'm out there every night building our future while you sit in this office perfecting contract clauses. If you can't see the value in that, maybe we need to revisit what this partnership actually is. The comment had hit like a slap. Dominic had spent that entire week debugging a catastrophic structural problem for their largest client. Work that had saved the company from a hostile takeover attempt. The idea that he was just sitting around perfecting clauses while Victoria did the real work was so fundamentally wrong it took his breath away. But he'd approved the 41,000 anyway. Because arguing felt like admitting he didn't understand something essential about how their business should grow. Because Victoria's certainty made him question his own instincts. Because some part of him was already afraid of what would happen if he said no. The public disrespect escalated through the spring. At a client all-hands meeting in March, someone asked about the firm's strategic direction. Victoria had smiled and gestured toward Dominic. Dom's incredible at what he does. Give him a tangled contract and he'll find every trap, every vulnerability, every hidden risk. But when it comes to the bigger vision, where we're going as a firm and how we get there, that's really my domain. I'm the one thinking about scale and growth while he handles the technical execution. The room had nodded approvingly. Dominic had felt his face go hot but kept his expression neutral. Later, one of the associates had approached him quietly. That was kind of harsh, wasn't it? I mean, you designed this whole firm's methodology. Dominic had shrugged. She's just differentiating skill sets, it's fine. But it wasn't fine, and it kept happening. At an investor gala in April, someone had asked Victoria about the secret to their success. She'd laughed, that practiced boardroom laugh. Honestly, knowing when to ignore my partner's instincts. Dominic thinks small because he came up small. Garage startups, bootstrap mentality. That works to a point, but if you want to play at Sterling's level, you need someone who understands that world from the inside. Sterling had been standing right there, nodding along like Victoria was delivering profound wisdom instead of casually dismissing everything Dominic had built. Dominic had excused himself early that night, claimed a headache. In the car alone, he'd sat in the parking garage for 20 minutes trying to understand when exactly Victoria had started seeing him as an obstacle instead of a partner. The breaking point came in late February, 3 weeks before their wedding. Dominic's largest client, a cybersecurity firm called Sentinel Systems, had been hit with a massive breach. Not of their own security, they were fine, but a client of theirs had been compromised, and the contract language Sentinel's previous lawyers had drafted left them exposed to catastrophic liability. The CEO had called Dominic directly, panic in his voice. "They're saying we owe $80 million in damages. Our insurance cap's at $20 million. This could destroy us." Dominic had spent the next 72 hours forensically analyzing the contract, looking for any angle, any interpretation that could limit Sentinel's exposure. He'd found it buried in a subordinate clause, an ambiguity in the indemnification language that created a legitimate argument for shared liability rather than exclusive responsibility. But the solution required immediate action. Sentinel needed to file a declaratory judgment action within 48 hours or lose the strategic advantage, which meant Dominic needed Victoria's M&A expertise to structure the filing and negotiate with the opposing counsel. He'd called her at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday. She'd been at dinner with Sterling and some portfolio CEOs. He could hear the restaurant noise in the background. "I need you back at the office. Sentinel's crisis just went nuclear and we have a 48-hour window." Victoria's sigh had been audible even through the phone. "Can this wait until morning? I'm in the middle of something important. Our largest client is facing bankruptcy. No, it can't wait." Another sigh. "Fine, I'll be there in an hour." She'd arrived 90 minutes later, clearly irritated at having her evening interrupted. They'd worked through the night, Victoria drafting the filing while Dominic refined the legal theory. By 6 a.m., they had a document strong enough to file. Sentinel's CEO had been effusive in his gratitude when they'd presented the strategy. "You just saved our company. Whatever you need, whenever you need it, we're there." Victoria had smiled her professional smile but hadn't said much. In the car afterward, Dominic had tried to acknowledge the collaboration. "That was good work. We make a solid team when it counts." Victoria had been looking at her phone, typing something. "Mm-hmm. You okay? You seem distant." She'd looked up then, something cold in her expression. "I'm fine, just tired. Some of us have actual strategic work that got interrupted for this fire drill." The comment had landed like a punch. Fire drill, their largest client facing existential crisis, and Victoria saw it as an inconvenient interruption of her real priorities. Strategic work meaning dinner with Sterling? Meaning building relationships that will matter long-term, yes. Sentinel's important, but they're one client. Sterling's network represents 50 potential clients. Dominic had let the conversation drop, too exhausted to fight. But something had shifted in that moment, a clarity he'd been avoiding for months. Victoria wasn't his partner anymore. She was someone calculating whether he still served her purposes. The wedding was scheduled for March 15th. They'd planned for a year, booked the Palace Hotel's grand ballroom, invited 180 guests. Victoria had wanted bigger, 300 people, full society wedding, but Dominic had pushed back on the expense. "We're doing well, but we're not Sterling Whitmore wealthy. Let's keep it elegant, but not ridiculous." Victoria had agreed, though her expression suggested she thought he was being small-minded again. With 3 weeks until the ceremony, Dominic had approached her with a proposal. Sentinel's situation had stabilized but required ongoing attention. 2 other major clients had projects heating up. The firm was stretched thin. What if we postpone the wedding 6 months just until we get through this crunch period? We could do something small now, City Hall, then have the big celebration in September when things calm down. Victoria had been reviewing invitations when he'd suggested it. She'd stopped mid-motion, her face going carefully blank. Postpone the wedding? Just temporarily. Everything's already paid for. We'd just push the date. 6 months isn't that long. She'd set down the invitation, her movements precise. Let me make sure I understand. You want to postpone our wedding because you're busy with work. We're both busy, I thought. No. Her voice had been ice. You're busy because you choose to be. I'm busy building something bigger than what we have. There's a difference. Victoria, I need some time to think. She'd left the office that afternoon and hadn't come back. Dominic had texted, called, tried to smooth things over. No response for 2 days. On day 3, the email arrived, sent from her professional account, copied to her personal attorney and the firm's accountant. Dear Dominic, after considerable reflection, I've concluded that our goals are fundamentally misaligned. The timing isn't right for this marriage or this partnership. I've accepted a senior counsel position with Whitmore Capital effective immediately and will be resigning from our firm. My attorney will contact you regarding partnership dissolution. I wish you well. Victoria. Dominic had read it 3 times, waiting for the punchline or the clarification. This couldn't be real. You didn't end an 8-year relationship and a multi-million-dollar partnership via email. But the follow-up from her attorney arrived within an hour. Formal notice of partnership dissolution, demand for distribution of assets, timeline for separation. The wedding was canceled in a single afternoon. Victoria's assistant had called the venue, the caterer, the florist. Everything terminated, deposits forfeited. The invitations that had gone out 2 months earlier were followed by brief cards. The wedding of Victoria Laurent and Dominic Ashford has been cancelled. No further information will be provided. Dominic had sat in their office, his office now, and tried to process what had just happened. 8 years, 3 of them as romantic partners, 5 as business collaborators, everything they'd built together, gone in a 2-paragraph email. His phone rang. James Chen, his best friend and occasional collaborator on tech contracts. I just heard. Are you okay? I have no idea. What do you need? Dominic had looked around the office at the case files and the client folders and the infrastructure they'd built together. I need to understand what just happened. What happened became clear over the next week. Victoria hadn't just decided to leave. She'd planned it, structured it, positioned herself for exactly this outcome. The evidence arrived through a mutual colleague, someone who felt Victoria had crossed ethical lines. An email thread forwarded anonymously, dated September of the previous year, 5 months before the breakup. Victoria communicating with Sterling's legal counsel about partnership dissolution strategy. Need clean exit from current partnership before IP ownership claims complicate future structure. Recommend documenting contribution disparity, establishing independent value proposition, terminating before marriage creates community property complications. The response from Sterling's lawyer had been clinically precise. Suggest establishing paper trail of sole value creation, distance yourself from joint work product, build case that partnership was primarily your client development leveraging his technical execution. Position departure as your evolution beyond his limitations. Every public comment Victoria had made over the past 6 months, every repositioning of their roles, every dismissal of his contributions. It had all been deliberate, building a narrative that would justify her exit and minimize his claim to shared value. She hadn't fallen out of love with him. She'd strategically extracted herself after calculating that he was worth less than the opportunity Sterling represented. The lawsuit arrived 2 weeks after the breakup. Victoria was demanding 45% equity in the firm plus $12 million in compensation for what she claimed was unpaid partnership value. Her argument was elegant in its ruthlessness. She'd brought all the major clients through her network and relationship development. Dominic had merely executed technical work that any competent contract attorney could have performed. The firm's value was attributable to her contributions, not his. The filing included exhibits, marketing materials emphasizing Victoria's client relationships, testimonials from clients praising her strategic guidance, financial analysis showing that 80% of revenue came from clients she'd originated. What it didn't include was any acknowledgement that Dominic had designed every single contract framework those clients relied on. That his architectural approach was what made their firm valuable in the first place. That clients hired them specifically because Dominic could see traps that other lawyers missed. Dominic's attorney, a solid if unspectacular litigator named Robert Barnes, reviewed the filing with obvious concern. She's built a strong case, the documentation is thorough, and frankly, from a pure business development perspective, she's right that most of the clients came through her network. But I created the methodology, the entire approach that makes us valuable, which is harder to prove than client origination. Unless you have clear documentation of your unique contribution, this becomes a he said, she said about who added more value. What are we looking at if she wins? Barnes had hesitated. $12 million you don't have. You'd need to liquidate the firm, sell the client relationships, probably declare bankruptcy. Everything you've built would be gone. Dominic had sat with that reality. Victoria had positioned her exit so effectively that losing to her in court would destroy him completely. And she'd done it with the same strategic precision she brought to every negotiation. The media coverage started within days. TechCrunch ran the story with a headline that made Dominic's stomach turn. Rising legal star Victoria Laurent leaves partnership for Whitmore Capital. The article quoted Victoria extensively. Sometimes you realize your partner's ceiling is your floor. Growth requires making hard choices about who can scale with you and who can't. I'm grateful for what Dominic and I built together, but I'm excited about the next chapter. Partner's ceiling is your floor. The comment got picked up everywhere, became a minor social media moment. People quoted it as wisdom about knowing when to move on, about not letting others limit your potential. No one seemed to notice that it was fundamentally cruel, that it reduced 8 years of partnership to Victoria's decision that Dominic simply wasn't good enough for where she was going. The engagement announcement came 6 weeks later. Victoria Laurent and Sterling Whitmore planning a June wedding. The society pages ran photos of them at charity galas and foundation events. Victoria radiant in designer gowns, Sterling's hand possessive on her waist. The wedding would be at the Palace Hotel, the same venue Dominic had booked for their March ceremony. Victoria had kept the deposit, kept the date arrangement, just changed the groom. The guest list, leaked through social media posts, included everyone from Dominic's professional world, his former clients, his law school mentors. Every connection he'd built over 15 years in the industry. Victoria was inviting them all to watch her marry a billionaire in the venue she'd stolen from their canceled wedding. James had come over the night Dominic saw the invitation list, found him sitting in the dark office, staring at nothing. This is beyond cruel. She's not just leaving, she's erasing you. She's establishing her narrative that she outgrew me, moved up, got the life she deserved. Everyone who matters in our industry will be there to witness it. So what are you going to do? Dominic had been quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. I'm going to find someone who can help me prove she's wrong. The email arrived 2 days later. LinkedIn message from someone named Elise Carrington, IP litigation attorney, partner at Carrington and Associates. Mr. Ashford, I read about your case in TechCrunch. Your ex-fiance's lawsuit contains 3 critical errors that any competent IP litigator would spot immediately. If you're interested in actually fighting instead of settling, I can help you destroy her claim. No fee until we win. Dominic had stared at the message for 5 minutes before responding. What kind of errors? The response came within an hour. The kind that happen when someone gets too confident in their own narrative. Victoria Laurent documented her contributions thoroughly, but in doing so, she also documented yours, and she made some very specific factual claims that I can prove are false. Interested in a meeting? They'd met the next morning at a coffee shop in Palo Alto. Elise Carrington was 35, sharp-featured and precise in her movements, the kind of person who radiated competent intensity. She'd brought a folder of documents, Victoria's lawsuit annotated with notes. Here's what your ex-fiancé did wrong. First, she claims you provided standard technical execution while she created strategic value. But you're not a standard contract attorney. You developed a specific methodology for identifying embedded structural traps. That's intellectual property, not technical service. Elise had pulled out a printout of an interview Victoria had given 2 years earlier. Second, she praised that methodology extensively in this profile. Quote, Dominic Ashford is the architect of the most sophisticated contract protection frameworks in the industry. His ability to see vulnerabilities that others miss is genuinely revolutionary. She attributed the core value proposition to you in writing to a major publication. I remember that interview. I'm sure you do. Now look at her lawsuit. She claims the firm's value comes primarily from her client development. That's a direct contradiction of her prior public statements. Any judge will notice. Elise had flipped to another document, an email exchange with one of their major clients. Third, and this is the kill shot, she claimed in her filing that she brought 80% of clients through her network, but I pulled public records on 6 of your biggest clients. 4 of them specifically cited your methodology in their decision to hire your firm. One CEO testified in another case that your approach saved his company from a hostile takeover. That's not Victoria's client development. That's your intellectual property creating market demand. Dominic had felt something shift in his chest, the first spark of actual hope since the email breakup. How do we prove all this? We build a counter-narrative, document every instance where clients specifically hired you for your unique approach. Gather expert testimony about the value of your methodology versus standard contract work. Show that Victoria was well compensated for her actual contributions and is now trying to claim ownership of your intellectual property. She has Sterling's entire legal team backing her. Elise had smiled, sharp and confident. Sterling's team is expensive. That doesn't make them good, and they've missed something fundamental about California partnership law. When one partner claims the other contributed minimal value, they open themselves up to discovery on what their own compensation reflected. Victoria was paid $340,000 over 5 years. That's not what you pay a minimal contributor. That's what you pay a well-compensated senior attorney who performed valuable but distinct work. She was worth every dollar of that. Exactly. Which means she was already compensated for her contributions. This lawsuit is double-dipping. She got paid for her work and now she wants equity for the same work. That's fraud. The word hung in the air. Fraud. Not a partnership dispute. Fraud. Dominic had leaned forward. What do you need from me? Everything. Every document, every email, every client file. I need to reconstruct the actual history of how value was created in your firm, and I need you to trust that I can see what Victoria's hiding. Why are you doing this pro bono? Elise had been quiet for a moment, something shifting in her expression. Because 10 years ago, my law partner, also my ex-husband, did something similar to me. Took the client relationships we'd built together and claimed they were solely his. I was young and scared, and I settled for pennies on the dollar. I've spent the last decade making sure other people don't make my mistake. She'd extended her hand. Let me help you fight back. Dominic had shaken it, feeling the first real clarity he'd had in weeks. When do we start? We already did. Victoria's wedding is June 7th, 12 weeks away. That gives us time to build an airtight case and file our countersuit. But there's something else we should consider. What? Elise had pulled out one more document, a partnership agreement between Sterling Whitmore's fund and 6 portfolio companies. I did some preliminary research on Sterling's investments. 3 of these companies are using contract frameworks that look remarkably similar to your methodology. If we can prove Victoria gave Sterling access to your intellectual property as part of her courtship strategy, this stops being a partnership dispute and becomes corporate espionage. You think she shared my work with Sterling? I think she's been positioning herself as the source of valuable IP that she can bring to Sterling's portfolio. And I think she did it using methodologies you created, which means Sterling's companies are built on potentially stolen intellectual property. Dominic had sat back, his mind racing through the implications. If Elise was right, this wasn't just about the lawsuit. This was about everything Victoria and Sterling had built together being fundamentally compromised. How do we prove it? Carefully, methodically, with better lawyers than they have. Elise had gathered her documents. I'm going to need those files, Dominic. Every client contract you've ever worked on. Every email where Victoria discussed your methodology with clients or with Sterling. Everything. You'll have it by tomorrow. She'd stood to leave, then paused. One more thing. Victoria thinks you're broken, that you'll settle because fighting is too hard and you don't have the resources. She thinks she's already won. What do you think? Elise had smiled. I think she made the same mistake a lot of smart people make. She assumed silence meant surrender. She'd headed for the door, then looked back. It doesn't. Sometimes silence is just someone getting ready to correct the record. After she left, Dominic had sat alone with his coffee, feeling something he hadn't felt in months. Not hope exactly. Something harder and more focused. Victoria thought she'd measured his worth accurately and found him wanting. She thought she'd positioned her exit so perfectly that he had no choice but to accept her narrative. She was about to learn the difference between being strategic and being right. The documents arrived at Dominic's office in 3 cardboard boxes delivered by a paralegal who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. 5 years of email archives, client files, contract templates, financial records. Everything Elise had requested, organized with the kind of precision that came from 15 years of compulsive documentation. Elise arrived an hour later with her own team. 2 forensic accountants who moved through financial data like surgeons, a tech contracts specialist who'd spent 20 years at Oracle, and a private investigator named Marcus Webb, who looked more like a philosophy professor than someone who dug up corporate secrets. We have 12 weeks to build an airtight case and position the reveal for maximum impact. Elise spread a timeline across the conference table. Victoria's wedding is June 7th. Sterling's signing a licensing agreement with you on the same day, same location, 2 hours before the ceremony. Dominic studied the timeline. He doesn't know it's a trap. He thinks it's you finally seeing reason, accepting that fighting is futile and settling for whatever terms he's willing to offer. Elise pulled out her laptop. Which brings us to the first phase. We need to prove 3 things conclusively. 1. Your methodology is genuine intellectual property, not just technical skill. 2. Victoria was fully compensated for her actual contributions. 3. She conspired with Sterling to steal your IP as part of her exit strategy. The tech specialist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Okoye, opened one of the boxes. Let's start with the methodology. Show me your oldest contract templates. Dominic pulled files from 2017, his first year as junior partner. Simple frameworks then, protection clauses for early-stage startups that couldn't afford big firm rates. But even in those early documents, the seeds of his approach were visible. The way he nested protective language inside standard clauses. The strategic ambiguity that gave clients flexibility while limiting exposure. Sarah studied them with the focus of someone reading poetry. This nested protection structure, where did you learn it? I didn't learn it. I developed it after watching a client get destroyed by what looked like a standard drag-along clause. The language seemed protective on its face, but it actually trapped them into a forced sale at below-market terms. And this ambiguity technique? That came from contract theory research. Most lawyers try to eliminate ambiguity. I realize strategic ambiguity can be protective if you control the interpretation framework. Sarah pulled out templates from 2019, then 2021, then 2023. Look at the evolution. Each iteration refines the core principles. This isn't standard practice variation, this is systematic development of a distinct approach. She turned to Elise. Any competent expert witness will confirm this is proprietary methodology. One of the forensic accountants, a precise man named Robert Kim, had Victoria's compensation records spread across another table. She received $340,000 over 5 years. That breaks down to base compensation of $200,000 plus bonuses tied to deal closure and client retention. What's market rate for an M&A attorney with her experience? Elise leaned over his shoulder. In the Bay Area? For someone at her level doing comparable work? Exactly what she was paid. She wasn't underpaid or undervalued. She was compensated appropriately for a senior attorney performing valuable but distinct work. Dominic watched them dissect 5 years of partnership in spreadsheets and document trails. Everything he and Victoria had built together, reduced to evidence in a fraud case. This feels wrong somehow, like I'm betraying what we had. Elise looked up sharply. What you had was a partnership based on mutual contribution and fair compensation. What she's doing now is rewriting history to claim ownership of your work. There's a difference between honoring the past and letting someone rob you. Marcus Webb, the investigator, had been quiet until now. He pulled out a thin folder, maybe 20 pages. I found something interesting in Victoria's public statements from the past 3 years. Interviews, conference presentations, social media posts. Want to hear what she said about Dominic Ashford before she decided to leave? He read from a printout, Victoria's voice from a 2022 podcast interview. Dominic is genuinely revolutionary in how he approaches contract architecture. Most attorneys see contracts as static documents. He sees them as dynamic systems where every clause interacts with every other clause. That systemic thinking is what makes our firm special. Another quote from a 2023 legal conference panel. The most valuable thing I bring to client relationships is access to Dominic Ashford's methodology. I can negotiate the deal terms, but the real protection comes from frameworks he designs. That's our competitive advantage. Marcus flipped to a third document, an email to a prospective client from 18 months ago. All structural design credit goes to Dominic. I handle the business development and deal execution, but the intellectual architecture is his domain. That's why our frameworks are more sophisticated than what you'd get from a standard corporate firm. The room went quiet. Dominic felt something tighten in his chest. Recognition of the person Victoria had been before she'd decided he was insufficient. She used to understand what we each brought, used to value it. She still understands it. Elise took the documents from Marcus. That's why her current lawsuit is fraud. She knows exactly what you contributed. She's just betting that her documentation of business development will outweigh your documentation of intellectual property creation. She laid out the quotes in a row. But she made a critical mistake. She praised your contribution so extensively in public that she can't credibly claim now that you added minimal value. These statements contradict her entire legal theory. Sarah pulled up something on her laptop. There's more. I cross-referenced client testimonials from public sources. 6 of your 10 largest clients specifically mentioned Dominic's methodology in interviews or case studies. One CEO said, and I quote, "Ashford's framework saved us from a hostile takeover that would have destroyed shareholder value. His ability to see structural vulnerabilities that our previous counsel missed was literally worth hundreds of millions to our company." That's not Victoria's client development. Robert looked up from his spreadsheets. That's Dominic's IP creating market demand. Clients hired your firm because of what you could do, not because Victoria knew the right people. Elise started pacing, her mind clearly working through legal strategy. Here's what we establish. Victoria was a valued partner who brought legitimate skills in negotiation and client management. She was compensated fairly for those skills at market rates. But the core value proposition of the firm, the thing that made clients choose you over bigger competitors, was Dominic's proprietary methodology. Victoria's current claim conflates her legitimate contributions with ownership of intellectual property she didn't create. Can we prove she shared that IP with Sterling? Dominic needed to know how deep the betrayal went. Marcus opened a second folder. Working on it. I've got a source inside Whitmore Capital who's willing to talk off the record. Says 3 of Sterling's portfolio companies restructured their governance frameworks in the past 8 months using what look like Dominic's techniques. Nested protection clauses, strategic ambiguity structures, the whole signature approach. How did they get access? That's what we need to prove, but the timeline is suggestive. Victoria started working closely with Sterling in January of last year. First portfolio company restructure happened in March, second in June, third in October, all using methodologies that match Dominic's templates. Elise stopped pacing. If we can prove Victoria gave Sterling access to Dominic's proprietary frameworks as part of her exit strategy, this becomes corporate espionage. Sterling's portfolio companies would be using stolen IP, which means their entire governance structures could be legally compromised. What's the combined value of those 3 companies? Marcus checked his notes. Current valuations, $320 million, $270 million, $300 million, combined $890 million. The number hung in the air. If those companies' foundational structures were built on stolen intellectual property, Sterling's fund faced catastrophic exposure. Investor lawsuits, SEC scrutiny, reputation destruction. Sterling needs Dominic to legitimize that IP. Elise's smile was sharp, which is why he'll agree to the licensing meeting. He thinks he's buying peace and legitimacy. He has no idea we're building a fraud case. Over the next 3 weeks, the evidence accumulated in layers. Sarah documented 47 distinct contract templates that bore Dominic's methodological signature, each one created between 2017 and 2024, each one demonstrably his work based on metadata, version history, and stylistic consistency. Robert compiled financial records showing Victoria's compensation matched market rates for her contribution level, eliminating any claim of undervaluation. Marcus gathered testimonials from 8 clients willing to testify that they'd hired the firm specifically for Dominic's approach. The smoking gun arrived on day 19. Marcus's source inside Whitmore Capital provided email archives that should have been privileged, but apparently someone had grown tired of watching ethical lines get crossed. The emails started in September, 5 months before Victoria's breakup email. Her initial outreach to Sterling's general counsel had been subtle, positioning herself as someone with valuable expertise who might be interested in joining his team. I've spent 5 years developing sophisticated client relationships in the tech space. More importantly, I have access to proprietary contract methodologies that could benefit your portfolio companies. If you're interested in discussing a senior counsel role, I'd welcome a conversation. Sterling's response had been immediate. Let's talk. We're always looking for talented attorneys who understand our ecosystem. The subsequent emails tracked Victoria's courtship strategy with clinical precision. She'd provided sample frameworks to demonstrate her expertise. The frameworks were Dominic's templates, stripped of identifying information but preserving all the sophisticated structural elements. Sterling's team had been impressed. These protection structures are more advanced than anything our current counsel has produced. Where did you develop this approach? Victoria's response made Dominic's hands clench. I've spent years refining these methodologies through client work. The nested protection architecture and strategic ambiguity techniques are my signature approaches. My signature approaches, not collaborative development with a partner, not frameworks created by someone else. My approaches. The emails continued through fall and winter. Victoria providing more templates, Sterling's team implementing them in portfolio companies, everyone praising Victoria's brilliance. By January, Sterling was offering a senior counsel position with equity participation. The final email in the thread was dated February 10th, 2 weeks before Victoria's breakup message to Dominic. Contract offer attached. Welcome to the Whitmore Capital family. Your expertise is going to transform how we protect our portfolio companies. Victoria's response, thank you. I'm excited to bring my full methodology to your platform. I'll need to extract myself from my current partnership first, but I have a clean exit strategy planned. Clean exit strategy. As if 8 years of partnership could be reduced to a tactical maneuver. Elise read through the emails twice, her expression growing harder. This is textbook corporate espionage. She represented the IP as her own creation, provided it to Sterling for his commercial benefit, and planned her exit to minimize your ability to claim ownership. Any reasonable prosecutor would file charges. I don't want her in prison. Dominic surprised himself with the certainty. I want the record corrected. I want everyone who's going to watch her marry a billionaire to know exactly what she had to steal to get there. Then we give them the truth in the most public way possible. Elise pulled out a calendar. Sterling's licensing meeting is June 7th at 10 a.m. Victoria's ceremony starts at 2 p.m. We file our countersuit on June 5th, 2 days before. That gives it time to hit the media, but not enough time for them to prepare a defense. What are we suing for? Fraud, conversion of intellectual property, conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, and breach of fiduciary duty. We're seeking return of all IP. She transferred to Sterling, disgorgement of any compensation she received from Whitmore Capital based on that IP, and a public acknowledgement that the methodologies were created by you. Not money? Money comes secondary. The primary relief we're seeking is correction of the record and return of property. Elise's eyes glinted. But yes, we'll also seek compensatory damages equal to the value she extracted through fraud, which, based on her compensation at Whitmore Capital and the value Sterling's companies gained from your IP, is approximately $85 million. The number was absurd, too large to process. Dominic laughed, short and bitter. I don't need $85 million. No, but Sterling needs to not pay $85 million, which is why he'll settle. Elise leaned forward. Here's how this plays. We file the suit. Media picks it up. Sterling's lawyers panic because they realize their portfolio companies are vulnerable. We offer Sterling a settlement. License your IP to his companies legitimately. He pays fair market value, and Victoria withdraws her lawsuit against you with a public admission that she had no ownership stake in your methodology. Why would Victoria agree? Because if she doesn't, we take the fraud case to trial and she faces potential criminal charges for corporate espionage. Sterling will force her to settle to protect his investments. Marcus cleared his throat. There's one complication. Victoria's not stupid. She's going to know this is coming, and she's going to prepare a counter-narrative. Let her try. Elise gathered the email printouts. The beauty of documentary evidence is it doesn't care about narrative. She can spin whatever story she wants. We have her own words claiming credit for IP she didn't create. That's fraud, and no amount of public relations can change it. The trap's architecture came together over the following weeks. Robert structured the licensing agreement that Sterling would sign, a legitimate contract offering Dominic's methodologies to Whitmore Capital's portfolio companies in exchange for upfront payment and equity participation. Fair value for legitimate use, the kind of deal that should have been negotiated months ago if Victoria had been honest about IP ownership. Sarah prepared expert testimony from 3 contract law professors, all willing to testify that Dominic's approach represented genuine intellectual property innovation. Marcus continued gathering evidence of Victoria's knowing misappropriation, building a timeline that showed clear intent to deceive. Elise drafted the lawsuit with surgical precision, 89 pages of detailed allegations, each one supported by documentary evidence. Email threads, template comparisons, client testimonials, expert analysis. The kind of filing that left no room for ambiguity about what had happened and who was responsible. Through it all, Dominic felt himself changing. The man who'd accepted Victoria's public dismissals, who'd approved $91,000 in questionable expenses, who'd believed postponing the wedding was a reasonable compromise, that man was gone. In his place was someone harder, more focused, someone who understood that silence wasn't the same as surrender. On May 15th, exactly 3 weeks before the wedding, Dominic reached out to Sterling through an intermediary, a mutual connection in the venture capital world, someone who could present the licensing proposal as genuine business rather than strategic trap. The pitch was simple. Dominic held valuable IP that several Whitmore Capital portfolio companies were already using. Rather than fight about ownership, why not establish a legitimate licensing relationship? Fair compensation, clear terms, everyone protected going forward. Sterling's response came within 24 hours. "I'm interested. Let's schedule a meeting to review terms." Dominic's intermediary suggested June 7th. "I know it's your wedding day, but Dominic's schedule is tight and this is the only opening that works for both parties. Would morning work, say 10 a.m.? Sterling had hesitated. Getting married at 2 that afternoon, signing a business deal at 10 seemed rushed. But the opportunity to clean up a potential IP problem before it became public was too valuable to postpone. 10 a.m. works. Let's do it at the Palace Hotel. I'll be there anyway for wedding prep." The intermediary had confirmed the meeting, then sent Dominic a brief message. "He took the bait. He has no idea what's coming." Elise had smiled when she heard. Classic mistake. He's so focused on the wedding and the optics of Victoria's big moment that he can't see the trap. He thinks this is Dominic accepting defeat and settling for whatever scraps he can get. What if he figures it out before June 7th? Then we file early and force his hand. But I don't think he will. Men like Sterling don't expect resistance from people they've categorized as defeated. You're the ex-fiancé who got dumped, who's drowning in a lawsuit you can't win, who should be grateful for any settlement. That's the narrative Victoria sold him. He won't question it until it's too late. The countersuit was filed on June 5th, 48 hours before the wedding. Elise arranged for service at Victoria's apartment at 7 a.m., ensuring she'd receive the papers first thing in the morning. Simultaneous service went to Sterling's office and his home address. The media picked it up by noon. TechCrunch ran the story first, their headline blunt and devastating. "Dumped tech lawyer accuses billionaire's bride of intellectual property theft." The article laid out the allegations in detail. Victoria Laurent had systematically misappropriated her former partner's proprietary contract methodologies, represented them as her own creation to secure a position at Whitmore Capital, and provided those stolen frameworks to multiple portfolio companies. The lawsuit included documentary evidence of her knowing deception and sought return of the IP plus damages. By 3 p.m., the story had spread to Bloomberg, Reuters, and the Wall Street Journal. The business press loved the narrative. Brilliant female attorney exposed as fraud, billionaire groom potentially complicit in corporate espionage, jilted ex-partner fighting back with receipts. Social media exploded. The same people who'd quoted Victoria's "ceiling is your floor" comment as wisdom now dissected it as evidence of calculated cruelty. Legal Twitter argued about whether the case had merit. Tech Twitter speculated about which Whitmore Capital companies were vulnerable. Victoria's response came at 6 p.m., A statement through Sterling's PR firm. These allegations are baseless and motivated by a former partner's inability to accept the natural end of a professional relationship. Ms. Laurent contributed substantially to the development of all methodologies in question and will vigorously defend against these meritless claims. The statement rang hollow against 89 pages of documentary evidence. No denial of specific facts, just vague assertions about contribution and merit. Sterling's lawyers called Elise at 7. "We need to discuss settlement before this gets uglier. I'm available Monday morning." Elise's voice was pleasant, unhurried. "Oh, wait, Monday is June 7th. I believe Mr. Whitmore has a wedding that afternoon. Perhaps we should meet earlier that day, say 10 a.m.? The lawyer's pause was audible. "The licensing meeting." "That's right. We can discuss both the licensing arrangement and the fraud case at the same time. Much more efficient." "Ms. Carrington, if this is some kind of trap, it's a business meeting, counselor. Your client wanted to license Mr. Ashford's IP. Mr. Ashford is willing to discuss terms. The fact that we'll also need to address Miss Laurent's fraudulent claims is simply reality. Both issues need resolution." Another pause. "I'll need to consult with my client." "Of course. We'll see you Saturday at 10. Elise hung up before he could respond. She turned to Dominic, who'd been listening to the whole exchange. "Sterling knows now. He's scrambling, trying to figure out how to contain this before his wedding becomes a media circus. Will he cancel the meeting? He can't. If he cancels, it looks like he's hiding something. If he shows up, he walks into our trap. Either way, we win." The next 36 hours felt like watching a storm gather. Victoria's legal team filed an emergency motion to seal the case, claiming the public allegations were damaging her reputation. The judge denied it. Once allegations are public, you can't unring the bell. Sterling's PR firm pushed back on the corporate espionage angle, issuing a statement that Whitmore Capital had acted in good faith based on Victoria's representations about IP ownership. The statement was technically accurate but undercut Victoria's defense by implying Sterling's team had relied on her claims of ownership rather than independently verifying them. The Wall Street Journal ran a deeper analysis on Friday, interviewing contract law experts about the case. Professor Miranda Blackwell from Harvard Law provided a quote that Elise immediately forwarded to the team. Based on the template comparisons included in the public filing, these methodologies bear clear hallmarks of systematic development by a single innovator. If Ms. Laurent claimed sole creation of frameworks that Mr. Ashford actually developed, that would constitute fraud regardless of her other contributions to the partnership. By Friday evening, the narrative had solidified. Victoria Laurent, ambitious attorney who'd leveraged a relationship to access valuable IP, then betrayed her partner to advance her career. Sterling Whitmore, billionaire who'd been sold fraudulent goods and was now scrambling to limit damage. Dominic Ashford, the brilliant methodologist who'd been erased from his own story but was fighting back with evidence. Dominic sat in his office Friday night reading the coverage with something close to vindication. Not satisfaction exactly, too much had been destroyed for simple satisfaction. But clarity. The world was finally seeing what he'd known for months. Victoria hadn't outgrown him. She'd robbed him and called it evolution. His phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. "This is Victoria. We need to talk before tomorrow, please." He stared at the message for a full minute. Part of him wanted to ignore it, let her twist in the uncertainty. Part of him wanted to hear what she'd say now that her narrative had collapsed. He typed a response. "Everything I need to say, I'll say tomorrow in front of witnesses." Her reply came immediately. "Dom, please, I never wanted it to be like this. You wanted exactly this. You just thought I wouldn't fight back. I thought you'd understand, that you'd see I was making the rational choice for both of us." The words landed like a slap. Even now, even caught in provable fraud, she thought this was about rational choice, about her doing what was best while he clung to sentiment. You stole my work and called it yours. There's nothing rational about fraud. I helped develop those methodologies. We worked together. How is that theft? Dominic felt something cold settle in his chest. She genuinely believed it. Believed that being in the room while he created something meant she'd created it too. See you tomorrow, Victoria. 10 a.m. Bring your lawyers. He blocked the number before she could respond. Elise had warned him this would happen. She's going to try to make you feel guilty for fighting back. She'll reframe her theft as collaborative development and your lawsuit as betrayal. Don't engage. Save everything for the meeting. Sound advice. But sitting alone in the office they'd once shared, Dominic felt the weight of what tomorrow would bring. Not just legal victory, but the complete destruction of whatever Victoria thought they'd built together. The final admission that the partnership had been based on lies and theft rather than mutual respect. His phone buzzed again. Different number, probably Victoria calling from Sterling's phone or a friend's line. He ignored it. The last text came at midnight. James, his only message. Tomorrow you take back what's yours. I'll be there if you need me. Dominic texted back. Thanks, I'm ready. And he was. 8 years building something with someone who saw him as material to exploit. 5 months of legal preparation to prove what had been stolen. 37 days of gathering evidence that couldn't be denied or spun or reframed. Tomorrow, in a conference suite 2 floors below where Victoria planned to marry a billionaire, the record would finally be corrected. She'd measured his worth and decided he was insufficient. She'd stolen his work and called it her evolution. She'd invited everyone in their industry to watch her marry up and leave him behind. Tomorrow, she'd learn what it cost to underestimate silence as weakness rather than strategy. Dominic shut down his laptop, turned off the office lights, and headed home. In 14 hours, everything would change. Victoria thought tomorrow was about her fairy tale wedding. Her triumphant arrival in Sterling's world, her complete escape from the partner she'd outgrown. She was wrong. Tomorrow was about justice. And unlike her narratives about ceilings and floors, justice didn't care about who had more money or better connections or a more compelling story. Justice cared about evidence, and Dominic had 89 pages of it. Saturday morning arrived with fog rolling off the bay, the kind of thick coastal gray that turned San Francisco's buildings into ghosts. Dominic stood in front of his bathroom mirror at 6 a.m., methodically shaving, his hands steady despite sleeping maybe 3 hours. The man looking back at him bore little resemblance to the one who'd received Victoria's breakup email 4 months ago. That man had been stunned, questioning, desperate to understand what he'd done wrong. This man knew exactly what had been done to him and exactly how to make it right. His phone showed 14 missed calls from unknown numbers. Victoria trying different lines, different tactics, anything to get him to engage before the meeting. He'd stopped reading her messages after the 5th one. They all followed the same pattern anyway. Appeals to their history, suggestions that they could work this out privately, implications that public confrontation would hurt them both. She still didn't understand. There was no both anymore. She'd made sure of that when she'd stolen his work and called it her evolution. Elise arrived at his apartment at 7:30 carrying coffee and a leather portfolio that contained enough evidence to destroy 2 careers and compromise nearly $1 billion in venture investments. Sterling's team called me twice this morning. They want to settle before the meeting. What did you tell them? That settlement discussions happen in person at 10 a.m. in the presence of all parties. She handed him the coffee. They're panicking. Victoria probably spent the night trying to explain to Sterling how documentary evidence of her fraud somehow isn't actually fraud. You think he'll show? He has to. If he cancels now, it confirms everything we've alleged. His only play is to show up, act confident, and hope his lawyers can negotiate something that doesn't completely destroy Victoria's credibility. or his portfolio company's legal standing. Dominic sipped the coffee, bitter and strong. What's our opening move? We let them talk first. Sterling's team will try to control the narrative, position this as a misunderstanding between former partners that got blown out of proportion. We sit quietly and let them present their version. Then we bury them with evidence they can't deny. Victoria will be there? She has to be. This is her fraud case. Sterling can't settle it without her participation. Elise's expression softened slightly. You ready to see her? I've been ready since I read those emails where she claimed my work as hers. They drove to the Palace Hotel in Elise's car, arriving at 9:40. The building was already crawling with wedding preparation activity, florists hauling arrangements through the service entrance, catering staff unloading vans, a wedding planner shouting instructions into her phone about table placements. All of it for a ceremony that would happen in 4 hours, assuming the bride wasn't too devastated by what was about to occur 2 floors below the reception ballroom. The Wentworth Conference Suite was smaller than Dominic expected, maybe 30 by 20 feet, dominated by a polished oak table that could seat 12. Sterling's team had already claimed one side. 3 lawyers in matching navy suits, Sterling himself at the head in charcoal gray that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and Victoria at his right hand. Dominic absorbed her appearance in a glance. She'd dressed for psychological warfare. Cream silk blouse, tailored black pants, minimal jewelry except for the engagement ring that caught light with aggressive brilliance. Her hair was done professionally, makeup perfect, the whole presentation designed to project confidence and control. But her eyes gave her away. Red-rimmed beneath the concealer, exhaustion poorly masked, the look of someone who'd spent the night fighting battles she wasn't winning. Sterling stood when they entered, extending his hand with practiced charm. Dominic, thank you for making time on what I know is a complicated day for everyone. Dominic shook the hand briefly, his grip firm but not aggressive. Let's talk about IP licensing. Of course. Sterling gestured to the chairs opposite his team. Though I hope we can also address the unfortunate lawsuit that's created unnecessary tension. Tension built on fraud isn't unnecessary. Elise settled into her chair, placing the leather portfolio on the table with deliberate care. It's the natural consequence of your fiancé stealing my client's intellectual property and misrepresenting it as her own creation. One of Sterling's lawyers, a silver-haired man whose nameplate read Thomas Westbrook, cleared his throat. Ms. Carrington, I think we can all agree that inflammatory language won't help us reach a productive resolution. I'm not interested in productivity, I'm interested in accuracy. Elise opened the portfolio but didn't remove anything yet. Your client hired Ms. Laurent based on her claims that she'd developed sophisticated contract methodologies. Those methodologies were actually created by Dominic Ashford. That's fraud. The language isn't inflammatory, it's descriptive. Victoria spoke for the first time, her voice tighter than Dominic remembered. I contributed substantially to the development of those frameworks. Dominic didn't create them in isolation. You negotiated deals using frameworks Dominic designed. That's not contribution to IP creation, that's skilled use of someone else's tools. Elise still hadn't pulled documents from the portfolio, just rested her hand on top like a promise. But please, continue. I'd love to hear your explanation for emails where you explicitly claimed sole creation of methodologies that bear Dominic's signature techniques. Sterling's hand moved to cover Victoria's before she could respond. What my fiancée contributed and how she characterized that contribution are separate issues. We're here to discuss licensing terms that work for everyone. Then let's discuss those terms. Dominic leaned forward slightly. My intellectual property has been used without authorization by 3 of your portfolio companies, TechVault, DataShield, and CloudGuard. All 3 restructured their governance frameworks between March and October of last year, using my nested protection architecture and strategic ambiguity techniques. Those restructures were done by Whitmore Capital's internal legal team based on industry best practices. Industry best practices don't include 47 proprietary techniques that match my template library with 93% structural similarity. Elise pulled out the first document, a side-by-side comparison prepared by Sarah. This is TechVault's current operating agreement next to a template Dominic created in 2021. The nested indemnification structure is identical down to the clause, ordering, and transitional language. Westbrook took the document, studied it with careful attention. His expression shifted, professional neutrality giving way to something closer to concern. This level of similarity could be coincidental. Corporate governance follows standard patterns. Could be. Except DataShield and CloudGuard show the same pattern with different Dominic Ashford templates. Elise distributed 2 more comparisons. And all 3 restructures happened after Victoria joined your team, but before she'd terminated her partnership with Dominic. She had access to his complete template library and provided it to you while representing the methodologies as her own creation. Victoria's composure cracked visibly. I never claimed I created them alone. I said I had access to sophisticated frameworks, which was true. You said, and I quote from your September email to Sterling's general counsel, I've spent years refining these methodologies through client work. The nested protection architecture and strategic ambiguity techniques are my signature approaches. Elise pulled out the email thread Marcus had obtained. My signature approaches, not collaborative development, not frameworks I have access to. My approaches, that's fraud, Ms. Laurent. The conference room went silent except for the muffled sounds of wedding preparation filtering through the walls. Someone was testing a microphone in the ballroom, feedback squealing briefly before cutting off. Sterling's jaw tightened, his gaze shifting to Victoria with something that looked like betrayal. You told me you'd develop these methodologies. I helped develop them. Over 5 years of partnership with Dominic, working together on client matters, you executed deals using frameworks I created. Dominic's voice was quiet but cut through her explanation like a blade. You were good at it, exceptional even. But execution isn't creation, Victoria, you know that. You've always known it. Her eyes met his finally, and for a moment he saw something raw beneath the professional armor. Shame maybe, or recognition that the narrative she'd built couldn't survive contact with documented reality. We built the firm together. We did. You brought clients and negotiated deals. I designed the protections that made those deals safe. Both roles were valuable. Both were compensated appropriately. The fraud happened when you claimed my role was actually yours and used that claim to secure a position here. Westbrook set down the comparisons. Mr. Whitmore, I need to speak with you privately. Sterling's hand waved him off. Whatever you need to say it here. The similarities in these documents create substantial exposure. If Mr. Ashford can prove his templates were misappropriated and used in our portfolio companies without proper licensing, those companies' governance structures could be legally compromised. Meaning what exactly? Meaning investors could challenge the validity of the restructures. Meaning we could face liability for using stolen intellectual property in companies we control. Meaning TechVault, DataShield, and CloudGuard are all preparing for major funding rounds or exits, and this kind of legal cloud could torpedo those transactions. The second lawyer, a younger woman whose nameplate read Jennifer Park, pulled out her laptop. Combined current valuations of those 3 companies are $890 million. If their governance structures are compromised, we're not just talking about reputation damage. We're talking about investor lawsuits, SEC scrutiny, and potential criminal referrals for corporate espionage. Victoria's face had gone pale beneath the makeup. This wasn't corporate espionage. I brought expertise to Whitmore Capital the same way any new hire brings their experience and knowledge. Experience and knowledge aren't the same as proprietary templates that legally belong to your former partnership. Jennifer's tone was clinical. the voice of someone calculating liability exposure. If those templates were partnership property, which Mr. Ashford's evidence suggests they were, then you misappropriated them when you provided them to us. Sterling stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the window overlooking the interior courtyard, where someone was stringing lights for the reception. His shoulders were rigid, the posture of a man realizing he'd been sold fraudulent goods and was now holding the bag. "What do you want, Dominic?" "I want a licensing agreement that legitimizes your use of my IP fair market value for the frameworks your companies have already implemented, plus equity participation going forward." "How much?" Elise pulled out a bound document, the licensing agreement Robert had structured. 85 million upfront payment for past unauthorized use, 12% equity in each of the 3 companies that implemented the frameworks, and a public acknowledgement that the methodologies were created by Dominic Ashford, not Victoria Laurent. The number landed like a physical blow. Sterling turned from the window, his expression incredulous. $85 million? That's approximately 10% of the combined enterprise value your companies gained from implementing sophisticated governance structures that protected them from hostile actions and positioned them for premium valuations. It's actually quite reasonable given the value created. And if I refuse, then we file an expanded lawsuit on Monday morning. Corporate espionage charges against Ms. Laurent, derivative claims against Whitmore Capital for knowingly using stolen IP. Investor notifications to all 3 companies that their governance structures are legally compromised. By Tuesday, every LP in your fund will be demanding answers about why their money is invested in companies with foundational legal problems. Westbrook had been reading the licensing agreement. This also requires Ms. Laurent to withdraw her lawsuit against Mr. Ashford and issue a public statement admitting she had no ownership interest in the methodologies. That's correct. The licensing deal and Victoria's fraud case are packaged together. You get legitimate IP rights going forward, Dominic gets compensated for past theft, and Victoria admits the truth about who created what. Victoria finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You want me to publicly admit I lied. I want you to publicly admit the truth." Dominic met her eyes across the table. "That the methodologies you claimed as yours were actually mine. That you were well compensated for your legitimate contributions but had no ownership stake in the IP. That's not asking you to lie, Victoria. It's asking you to stop lying." Her hands were shaking now, the confident professional facade completely shattered. "Do you have any idea what this will do to my reputation? To my career?" "I know exactly what it will do. The same thing your theft did to mine, except you actually deserve the consequences." Sterling returned to the table, his movements sharp with barely controlled anger. "How did this happen, Victoria? You told me you'd developed these frameworks, that they were your work." "I contributed to their development. Over 5 years of working with Dominic on client matters, refining approaches, testing strategies. That's not what you said in September." Sterling's voice was ice. "You said they were your signature approaches, that you'd spent years refining them. You let me believe you'd created them, and I built our legal strategy around that belief." "I never explicitly said I was the sole creator. You never explicitly said you weren't." Elise's interruption was surgical. "You created deliberate ambiguity about authorship, knowing Sterling and his team would assume you'd created what you were offering. That's fraud by omission, Ms. Laurent. The fact that you're a lawyer makes it worse, not better." Jennifer was typing rapidly on her laptop, probably calculating exposure and running scenarios. "Mr. Whitmore, our liability here is substantial. If we fight this and lose, we're looking at catastrophic damage to the fund's reputation. Every investment we've made could be questioned, LPs could withdraw, new deals could evaporate. And if we settle, we take a major financial hit, but we legitimize the IP usage and limit ongoing exposure. It's damage control, not damage prevention, but at this point prevention isn't an option." Sterling sat down heavily, his hands flat on the table. Victoria, I need to know the complete truth right now. Did you or did you not create the methodologies you brought to Whitmore Capital? She was crying now, tears cutting through the makeup in dark tracks. I helped develop them. I was there for every client implementation, every refinement, every strategic decision about how to apply the frameworks. That's not what he asked. Dominic's voice remained steady, almost gentle. He asked if you created them, and we both know the answer is no. You watched me create them. You learned how to use them effectively. You contributed valuable insight about client needs and negotiation strategy, but you didn't design the nested protection architecture or the strategic ambiguity techniques or any of the other structural elements that make those frameworks valuable. I did. The acknowledgement hung in the air. Victoria's silence was admission enough. Sterling's expression had gone from anger to something colder, more distant, the look of someone reassessing every interaction through a new lens of doubt. You made me complicit in fraud. I brought valuable expertise to your organization. You brought stolen property and lied about ownership. There's a difference. He turned to Westbrook. What happens if we don't settle? Protracted litigation, public discovery of all communications between Ms. Laurent and our team, detailed examination of how the methodologies were obtained and implemented. Every questionable statement she made gets scrutinized in depositions and potentially in open court. The 3 portfolio companies get dragged through months of uncertainty about whether their governance structures are valid. And at the end, we probably lose anyway because the documentary evidence is overwhelming. And if we do settle, we pay substantial money, but we get clean IP rights going forward, and this ends quietly. Ms. Laurent admits fault, which damages her reputation but limits our institutional exposure. Sterling looked at Victoria, and Dominic saw the moment the relationship fractured beyond repair. Whatever they'd built together over the past year, whatever vision of partnership they'd created, it couldn't survive this kind of foundational dishonesty. Sign the settlement. Admit what you did. We'll deal with the rest later. Sterling, please, you lied to me, Victoria, about something fundamental. Made me build strategy around fraudulent claims. Made my companies vulnerable to exactly this kind of attack. His voice was quiet but absolute. Sign the settlement or I withdraw all legal support and you face Dominic's lawsuit alone. Your choice. The cruelty was efficient, the same kind of calculated ruthlessness Victoria had deployed when she'd decided Dominic's ceiling was her floor. She'd chosen Sterling for his power and wealth, and now that power was being used to force her compliance. Elise slid a second document across the table. This is the settlement agreement for your lawsuit against Dominic. You withdraw all claims, admit you had no ownership interest in the methodologies, and issue a public statement acknowledging Dominic Ashford as the sole creator of the contract frameworks you used during your partnership. Victoria read through the document with shaking hands, her tears falling onto the pages. This destroys everything. It corrects the record. Dominic's voice held no satisfaction, just finality. You tried to erase me from work I created. This puts my name back where it belongs. She looked up at him, mascara streaked, the polished professional completely gone. I loved you once. Doesn't that count for anything? The question hit harder than expected, pulling at something Dominic thought he'd locked away. He'd loved her too, or thought he had. But looking at her now, destroyed by consequences she'd engineered herself, he felt only a distant sadness for what they'd both lost. If you loved me, you would have valued what I created instead of stealing it. Love doesn't measure someone's worth by their bank account and decide they're insufficient. I never said you were insufficient. You said my ceiling was your floor, in public, to everyone who mattered in our industry. The words came out harder than intended. You measured me against Sterling's billions and decided I was less than. That's not love, Victoria. That's calculation with sentiment attached. Sterling pushed a pen across the table. Sign both documents. Now! Victoria stared at the pen like it was a weapon, which in a way it was. Her signature would end any pretense that she'd been anything other than a well-compensated employee who'd stolen her boss's work and tried to pass it off as her own creation. Would confirm that her rapid rise to Sterling's side had been built on fraud. Would make her wedding day, happening in less than 3 hours, the public ceremony of a relationship founded on lies. She picked up the pen, her hand hovered over the licensing agreement's signature line, and for a moment Dominic thought she might refuse, might force this to litigation and discovery and everything that came with protracted legal warfare. But survival instinct won. She signed the licensing agreement first, her signature shaky but legally binding, then the settlement of her lawsuit against Dominic, each page initialed, each admission of fault acknowledged in writing. No ownership interest, fully compensated. Methodologies created by Dominic Ashford. The narrative she'd tried to build collapsing into documented truth. Finally, the public statement Elise had drafted. 3 paragraphs acknowledging that sophisticated contract methodologies used during her partnership with Dominic Ashford were created by him. That she'd been appropriately compensated for her contributions to business development and deal execution, and that any prior statements suggesting sole or primary creation of the frameworks were inaccurate. When she finished signing, the silence in the room felt absolute. Victoria sat with her hands in her lap, shoulders curved inward, the physical embodiment of defeat. Sterling signed the licensing agreement without ceremony, his movements mechanical. $85 million in equity participation in exchange for legitimate rights to IP. His companies had been using illegally for months, the price of trusting Victoria's claims without verification. Westbrook gathered the documents. These will be filed with the court by close of business today. The public statement will be distributed to relevant media outlets simultaneously. Today? Victoria's head snapped up. The wedding is in 3 hours. The timing is unfortunate but necessary. Elise's tone was professionally neutral. The lawsuit was public. The settlement needs to be public too, particularly the acknowledgement of IP creation. You're doing this to humiliate me. We're doing this to correct the record. Dominic stood, the meeting clearly over. You tried to erase me from my own work. The correction happens publicly because the erasure was public. That's not humiliation, Victoria. That's just accuracy finding the same audience as your lies. Sterling stood as well, not looking at Victoria. I need to speak with my team, alone. The dismissal was clear. Dominic and Elise gathered their materials while Sterling's lawyers huddled around him, already strategizing how to spin this to his LPS and portfolio companies. Victoria remained seated, staring at the documents she'd just signed like they might disappear if she looked hard enough. Dominic paused at the door, looking back at her one last time. The woman he'd loved, the partner he'd trusted, the person he'd thought understood the value of building something real together. All of it gone, replaced by someone who'd gambled everything on theft and narrative control and lost. For what it's worth, I hope you find something real with Sterling. Something that doesn't require you to diminish someone else to feel successful. She didn't respond, didn't even look up, just sat with her hands in her lap while her wedding day collapsed around her. In the hallway outside the conference suite, Elise checked her phone. Settlement documents are being filed now. Public statement goes out in 20 minutes. How long before media picks it up? Given that it's Saturday, maybe an hour. By the time her ceremony starts, the story will be everywhere. Dominic leaned against the wall, the adrenaline of confrontation fading into something heavier. She's going to walk down that aisle knowing everyone's seen the admission. She could cancel. She won't. Canceling admits defeat. She'll go through with it and try to salvage what she can. Elise studied him carefully. How do you feel? Tired, relieved, sad for what this all became. He pushed off the wall, but mostly just glad the truth is out there. She can't rewrite what happened anymore. They walked toward the hotel exit, passing wedding staff who were oblivious to the legal devastation that had just occurred upstairs. Florists arranging centerpieces, caterers setting up bars, musicians doing sound checks. All of it for a ceremony that would now happen under the shadow of very public fraud. Dominic's phone buzzed. Text from James. "Just saw the news, you okay?" He typed back. "Better than okay. It's done." Outside, the fog had burned off, leaving one of those crystalline San Francisco afternoons where the light turned everything sharp and clear. Dominic breathed in the cool air, feeling something shift in his chest. Not happiness exactly, but the absence of the weight he'd been carrying since February. "What happens now?" Elise stood beside him on the sidewalk. "Now I rebuild, start over with a clean foundation this time." "And Victoria?" "Victoria married a billionaire built on fraud. She'll have to live with that." He turned to face Elise fully. "But I wanted to thank you for seeing what I couldn't see at first, for fighting when I wasn't sure fighting was worth it. The work was worth fighting for. You created something valuable and someone tried to steal it. That's always worth correcting." They stood in the afternoon sun while inside the Palace Hotel, 2 floors above, where they'd just dismantled Victoria's narrative, preparations continued for a wedding that would now be remembered for all the wrong reasons. Dominic imagined Victoria in her bridal suite, makeup artist trying to repair tear damage, wedding planner demanding to know if the ceremony was still happening. Sterling probably locked in another room recalculating his entire relationship through the lens of documented deception. Part of him felt guilty for the destruction. Part of him wondered if he should have settled quietly, taken money and moved on without the public exposure. But the larger part, the part that had spent 4 months being erased from his own story, felt only certainty that this was right. You don't correct lies in private. You correct them everywhere the lies were told. His phone buzzed again, this time a news alert. TechCrunch. Breaking. Victoria Laurent settles IP. Theft lawsuit. Admits fraud in public statement. The story was live. Within minutes it would be everywhere, and everyone invited to watch Victoria marry a billionaire would know exactly what she'd had to admit to get there. Elise saw the alert too. No going back now. There was never any going back, only forward. Dominic pocketed his phone. "Can I buy you lunch? Somewhere far from here?" "I'd like that." They walked toward Elise's car while behind them in the grand ballroom of the Palace Hotel, Victoria Laurent prepared to become Victoria Whitmore in a ceremony that would be overshadowed by the truth she'd spent months trying to hide. The record was corrected. The theft was acknowledged. The silence Dominic had maintained while gathering evidence had proved stronger than all of Victoria's calculated words. And in 3 hours, when she walked down that aisle wearing a dress that cost more than most people's cars, everyone watching would know that she'd bought her way into Sterling's world with intellectual property she'd stolen from the man she'd left behind. That wasn't revenge. It was just accuracy finally catching up.